Good afternoon, and thank you for joining RadSite's webinar, 2020 RadSite ConeBeam CT Standards Overview. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's presentation is being recorded, and an email containing the link will be sent to all registered participants early next week. To minimize noise and distractions, all attendees' phones have been muted. However, if you have a question or comment during the presentation, we encourage you to submit it using the chat box section on the lower right side of the webinar portal. We will do our best to address all questions and comments at the end of the presentation. I will now turn the presentation over to our moderator, Gary Carneal, RadSite's President and CEO. Gary?
Well, welcome everybody to today's webinar. You know, when I think about the healthcare system, all of us who are in the field, it's ever changing, right? We're always talking about innovation. And I think today we're going to hear a lot about a pretty exciting new imaging modality, ConeBeam CT, which actually has been around for a while, and talk about how RadSite has embarked on a 2-year journey to develop what I consider fairly high fidelity standards in the ConeBeam CT imaging space to promote better clinical outcomes and the financial efficacy of these types of imaging for patients. If you want to learn a little bit more about ConeBeam CT systems themselves, RadSite hosted a wonderful webinar last month on the ConeBeam CT industry, and that webinar is still available on RadSite's website. If you just click and register, and you can learn all about the background as to what ConeBeam CT is all about. Today's focus is going to be more on the standards development effort and some related activities. It's my pleasure to introduce 3 remarkable speakers that have been participating supporting RadSite's efforts over the past 2 years. First, we have Dr. Harrell. He served as the chair of the RadSite ConeBeam CT Standards Committee for the past 2 years, so my hat's off to him for helping us navigate through this process. He's in active practice in orthodontics, TMG therapy, and dental sleep medicine. He also happens to be the associate professor at the University of Alabama, Birmingham School of Dentistry and the orthodontic department. Dr. Harrell has a passion in 3D and 4D imaging beginning in 1982 with his work with the Atari computer. That really brings back some memories, Bill. He developed research and published and envisioned how orthodontics, TMG, dental sleep medicine could be improved dramatically if accurate 3D and 4D imaging were available in clinical practices. And in fact, he walked the walk. In 2005, he became the first practice in Alabama to have a 3D ConeBeam CT imaging and the first orthodontic practice in the USA to have both ConeBeam CT and 3D facial imaging. He has served as the past president of the Alabama Association of Orthodontics, and he's published numerous textbooks, articles, and chapters on this field, covering all the topics that I just mentioned. He graduated in 1971 from the University of Alabama with a BS degree in chemistry and math and minor in biology. And he graduated from the same university, from the School of Dentistry in 1975. And he's board certified in orthodontics from the University of Pennsylvania in 1977. Our second speaker today is Dr. Powell. He also has served as a standards coordinator for the ConeBeam CT Standards Committee for the past 2 years, so he's worked hand in hand with Dr. Harrell to help navigate through and develop the standards. In his current position, he's the president of the Payer Provider Syndicate, a management advisory and operational consulting firm focused on managed care and healthcare delivery industries. Dr. Powell is a healthcare economist by training, and he uses quantitative techniques to examine issues concerning technology, operations, and firm decision-making. He publishes research on healthcare quality as it applies to mHealth, high-cost interventions, and imaging. He serves on the editorial board for the Medical Internet Research JMR Mental Health Journal, and he also serves on the scientific advisory board for CyberGuide. He has a bachelor's degree from MIT and a doctorate and master's degree from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Finally, Dr. Siegel is RadSite's Chief Medical Officer, and he's also serves as chair of RadSite's other standards committee, the MIPA Accreditation Committee, which has been around for the better part of 10 years. In his current position, he serves as professor and vice chair of research informatics at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, Department of Diagnostic Radiology, and he's just chief radiologist in nuclear medicine for the VA Maryland healthcare system that's located in Baltimore. Dr. Siegel is world renowned. He's responsible for NCI's National Cancer Image Archive and workspace lead for the National Cancer Institute CA Big and VO imaging workplace. And under his guidance, the VA Maryland healthcare system became the first filmless healthcare enterprise in the United States. Dr. Siegel has published over 200 articles and book chapters about picture archiving and communication systems, also known as PAC systems, and digital imaging, and has edited 6 books on the topic, including filmless radiology and security issues. He has made more than 1,000 presentations throughout the world on a broad range of topics, and using computers in medicine, including artificial intelligence, and he received his MD degree from the University of Maryland. So we have a tremendous speakers today, and what we're going to try to do is really give you a little background on RadSite, talk a little bit about the RadSite's MIPA accreditation program standards ecosystem that covers advanced diagnostic imaging systems, not only in the future ConeBeam CT, but traditional CT, MRI, and new medical medicine imaging. Why did RadSite embark on this journey for 2 years to develop ConeBeam CT standards? And give you a sense as to what we've come up through a brief walkthrough. Talk a little bit about what makes RadSite unique as an accreditation agency, and talk about quality and performance opportunities where we're working in the public policy arena, and then next steps in terms of when we're going live with the ConeBeam CT accreditation program. So RadSite, one of the things I love about accreditation, I personally have been in the accreditation space since the mid-1990s and have helped bring over 25 different accreditation programs to market. And one of my absolute favorite things about accreditation is building these communities of diverse stakeholders that come together to really work through different issues. And I think ConeBeam CT is a good example of that. And so what we're trying to do through the Standards Committee and through volunteers is really to develop the very best set of standards for a particular area. So obviously today we're talking about ConeBeam CT. RadSite has a lot of experience. People don't realize we're probably one of the best kept secrets in terms of imaging quality. We, going back to 2005, have certified over 60,000 imaging systems in 25,000 provider locations. We've been focusing on accreditation for really almost the past 10 years as an adjunct to our mission. Of course, today we're going to be trying to really address the opportunities to create standards for ConeBeam CT that are specific and then also potentially more uniform over time. So hold on to your hats. This slide kind of showcases a little bit of our history as an organization. As I mentioned early on, we were actually working with payers and states to do online certification programs to look at key aspects of both low-tech and high-tech imaging. But in 2011, we began developing the MIPA accreditation programs. And you can see that in 2020, this year, it's going to be very action-packed. We're working on a new set of the traditional MIPA standards for version 3.1 on the specialty modules, which Dr. Siegel will talk about in a minute. And then we're in the final phases of launching both the dental and the medical ConeBeam CT standards. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Siegel, who's going to tell us a little bit about kind of these new specialty accreditation modules that we've been developing. Dr. Siegel?
Thanks, Gary. So as you mentioned in your standards milestones, starting in 2020, there was the addition of a variety of different subspecialty modules that were added. And these took into account the idea that there requires some additional subspecialty expertise and also recognition that a subset of practices are practicing predominantly in particular subspecialty areas. And so this was done for non-ConeBeam CT and MRI and nuclear medicine, as you can see in the chart, but importantly and most pertinent to this discussion, for ConeBeam CT as well. And the 6 areas that we recognize in ConeBeam CT are dental, ENT, mammography, maxillofacial, orthopedics, and podiatry, recognizing that there are unique requirements with regard to those who obtain the images and unique requirements as far as those who oversee the images that may be different for ConeBeam CT practices in comparison with other practices. So looking specifically at the special needs of dental practice, the special needs of ENT ConeBeam, particularly looking at sinus disease and diseases of ear, nose, and throat, including temporal bone, looking at the very subspecialized area of ConeBeam CT as applied to breast imaging, and then certainly the subspecialty within dental practice and also subspecialty within the medical practice of maxillofacial surgery. Orthopedics, there are an increasing number of orthopedic systems that are out there, and then a recognition in podiatry of the idea that podiatrists have a fairly specific subspecialty area with specific recognition of their specialty and the roles performed in podiatry per se. So we believe that this is a significant upgrade by recognizing these modules and having particular standards that go along with those modules from a credentialing perspective as well as a technical and professional perspective as well. So thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Dr. Siegel. So just one additional observation. So up until today, RadSite has offered 3 different accreditation programs under the MIPA banner, one for traditional CT or non-ConeBeam, one for MRI, and one for nuke med. So this typology represents the subspecialties, what we're calling, the MAP standards version 3.1. So our 4th and 5th accreditation programs, which will be hopefully rolled out as early as next month, is for dental medical version 1.0 and include these subspecialties. So this allows a fair amount of detail as to what a different imaging provider is getting accredited for. And of course, an imaging provider can apply for more than one program and for more than one specialty. And we'll talk a little bit about that more later. Dr. Harrell, you want to talk a little bit, why the heck did we start this journey of developing ConeBeam CT standards almost 2.5 years ago?
I'll be glad to. I want to give you a little background of me, a couple other things that I think are maybe pertinent to this. Dr. David Hatcher and I actually got to see the first output of ConeBeam CT at an AAO meeting in 1996. And then Dr. Hatcher was really one of the first, he was the first one that claims to use the ConeBeam. He got his ConeBeam a day after Loma Linda. So this was the old Newtome, or the Newtome at that time. But I really appreciate everybody being online and hearing us today. And here's some of the RadSite team, Adam Powell and Gary and Julie Irons and Elliot and Patty and a lot of others. But there seems to be a lack of awareness about ConeBeam CT, even though it's been out there a good number of years now. We got ours like Gary said in 2005, which was about 4 years after it was introduced to the United States. We looked at clinical efficiency of diagnostic exams and what's better, 2D or 3D. I think we're moving more toward 3D because we understand the geometric errors of projections of panoramics and cephs that we specifically use in orthodontics. And there's no national standards out there really for ConeBeam CT. It's a little different. Traditional medical grade CT, there are standards, but there's some ineffective overlap between what we do with ConeBeam and really the traditional medical grade CT standards, even though there are some that overlap each other correctly, but there's some that are not. And we need more specific covering of the imaging specialties. The different type of specialties need different resolutions, different fields of view. which all affect the radiation dose and things that we'll look at a little later. We need some benefits of uniform physics requirements. Those are, I think, something that the insurance companies have maybe complained about ConeBeam. We don't have standards like we do in medical CT, and for them to reimburse us, there's still a little ambiguity that exists today, and so that's kind of one of the things that we're trying to clear up, is getting us paid for these things and doing it in the right way, so insurance companies will look at us a little bit differently and be able to have the standards set. And it's all in the patient's best interest of what we're doing.
Dr. Harrell, what percentage of practices currently that have ConeBeam systems are getting insurance reimbursement for those systems? Would you say it's the vast majority, or half, or a fraction?
I'm gonna guess, but I think most do, but we still have a lot of ambiguity. Probably half of them do. Half of them, you've got to substantiate it. Of course, you have to do that anyway, but it just seems to be, it's weird, because you'll file one on the same insurance company and they'll pay, and then the next one has the same insurance company but a different policy, and for some reason it won't pay. And it's just like insurance, you just don't know sometimes which ones will and which ones don't. Blue Cross here in Alabama seems to do pretty reasonable.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's interesting. I didn't know that there were any sort of compiled statistics. So I know you have a really good feel for that. So it sounds like there's lots of opportunities for education there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And to give, one thing that always comes up about ConeBeam, it has in orthodontics and many others, is the radiation dose. And this was an article that I helped write with Dr. Sean Carlson and others about the truth about ConeBeam CT radiation back in 2011. Now, this was based on older, not the low dose and ultra low dose technology. So this was back in 2011, but there are public health officials and other groups that look at the loss of life expectancy when you do certain risky things, like smoking cigarettes. You tend to lose about 2,300 days of your life. If you go down the list, I'm not going to go into all of them, but 2 cups of coffee a day costs you about 2 days of your life, or 26 days of your life. Going down to a diet drink a day. Anyway, they even peanut butter. They even look at, like peanut butter can cost you a little over a day of your life, and not being married. This is the weird one up here. You're not being married. It's something to having a partner, I guess. But anyway, if you come on down here, 3D X-ray, ConeBeam CT seems to sit right up under getting struck by lightning. Your chances of your chances of getting struck by lightning, and then you've got ConeBeam CT. You basically, if you figure it out, you lose about 15 minutes of your life, technically, at a 74 microsievert. Now, like I said, this was back in the in 2011. Those doses have gone down significantly now, where in 2020 your ConeBeam dose is about 15 microsieverts, which is less than a panoramic X-ray. So it's 5 times less than this, which is about 3 minutes of your life. And if you look over here, this was the article that we did it in. Back in that day, it's probably still true today. One-way ticket from New York to Los Angeles, you get about 36 microsieverts in that flight. So you get about 72 microsieverts, which is about what this is. So you get about 1 ConeBeam of radiation dose if you fly a round trip from New York to Los Angeles, to put it in perspective. We can go to the next slide. And this is an interesting slide because what it does, it's the hypothetical cost of your risk based on loss of life expectancy, equating it to your life to $1 million home. If you got a total life expectancy of a little over 77 years, if you smoke cigarettes, you're going to lose about almost $100,000, almost 80 something thousand dollars of your worth of your house. 2 cups of coffee a day costs you about $921,000 or $921. If you come way down here to modern 3D orthodontic ConeBeam x-rays, it costs you about 35 cents. That's at a 74 microsievert range. If at that time, traditional orthodontic cephs and pan was about 17 cents, but now in 2020, at a dose of about 15, which is less than a pan's about 24, that's 5 times less, so that's costing you about 7 cents. So the whole point now is the radiation dose on a ConeBeam, not a full field of view and not a higher resolution, but a medium field of view and a little bit lower resolution, is less than taking a panoramic x-ray. So you have to ask specific questions of what you need. What are you trying to look for? Are you looking for airway? Are you trying to assess maybe the anatomical reasons that sleep disorders, breathing may be part of it, or the craniofacial structure which goes along with that, and the dental development? And a lot of times what happens when you look at these is 3D ConeBeam and even 3D facial imaging may be considered the imaging of choice. So we have to kind of keep that in mind now. Okay. So basically ConeBeam, you know, you're looking at standards, you're looking at the MAP standards. They're been under development with our committee for over 2 years. The standards committee has met well over 20 times. We're currently in the beta testing area right now and learning and trying to find out all the different aspects of what we're trying to accomplish. We expected to launch it probably early summer, probably coming up soon. And then the dental and medical standards, we're trying to, you know, take the medical standards and apply them the best we can toward dental. And then, like Elliot said, we've got different specialty areas of ConeBeam in dental, ENT, maxillofacial, orthopedic, and podiatry. And we're going to look at version 1. We're going to look at the phantom testing that's included in by the manufacturers, but we're working on a uniform phantom testing that we can use on any machine that might give us even a little bit better information on the phantom testing. Now, this is a pretty busy slide. I think Adam is going to explain this a little bit further in a second, but I think this slide just kind of gives you an idea of how extensive all this is, the different sections that are included, and then the different type standards. You see, it's not just one standard; it's many different standards within these subgroups. So I think that's is something to be really aware of, and why we're, you know, it's taken us a little while to get all these standards done, but we're getting very close on finishing up these things.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Howell. So as I transition to Dr. Powell, one of the things to keep in mind is that the CBCT standards have been drafted with really kind of the MIPA framework coming from the regulations that CMS published about 10 years ago. And then in addition, what we try to do, you don't see all the standards here, but we're trying to harmonize our standards so where we can have identical standards between the 5 different accreditation programs we can, but then pursuant to Dr. Siegel's and Dr. Harrell's comments, when there's something unique to the specialty area, we can add some fine tuning to that. So this gives you kind of the overview, but we're going to ask Dr. Powell now to kind of go into a little bit more detail and look at some of the standards to give you a better flavor as to what we're covering. Dr. Powell.
Thank you for the kind introduction. So I've been very interested in both quality in physical health and quality in mental health. And something that's underlying in all the thought behind quality is the Donabedian model, which basically says there are three types of quality. There's structural quality, having the right things in place. There's process quality, doing the right things. And then there's outcome quality, getting the right results. And as we've been developing the standard, we've been thinking about all three types of quality and ensuring that organizations that have gone through this process and been certified have done the things they need to do so that they've got structural quality, process quality, and outcome quality. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through a number of the sections in the standard and also explain the approach that we've taken to writing them. So we start off easy with section 1, which is the imaging provider information section. We ask the organization for some information about itself. For instance, we ask it for its location and the scope of its services. We then, in 1.2, ask the organization to provide the imaging provider specialty information. And what we're doing is we're trying to make sure that we know what the organization is and what it's doing and what laws apply to it. In section 1.3, we've got imaging facility requirements. Here we talk about how the organization has to make sure it meets its local zoning laws and ordinances, it complies with federal law, maintains confidentiality, etc. In 1.4, we have non-imaging systems requirements. Here, we talk about how the imaging provider's non-imaging system should meet various standards and have quality control, as well as regular inspection and maintenance. And then we conclude section 1.5 with mobile imaging requirements. While not every organization has mobile imaging, we have considered some organizations that do and have put forth some requirements regarding mobile imaging. General requirements, how leasing should be handled, and safety protocols for mobile modalities. We address accreditation requirements for imaging systems in section 2. So in section 2, we start out with standard 2.1, which is imaging systems requirements. Here we have basically not that much. It says that the imaging provider shall provide information on all imaging systems supporting ADI services to demonstrate the proper installation, calibration, use, maintenance, and troubleshooting of imaging systems according to manufacturer recommendations and in compliance with all federal, state, and local requirements, and that for each imaging system demonstrate that the imaging provider meets the applicable manufacturer's recommendations for quality control testing as defined later in the standards. And then we go on to some specific ConeBeam CT imaging systems requirements. Got some general requirements about the specifications of the equipment. We've got some thresholds that have to be met, and then some additional requirements for cardiac imaging where applicable. And then we move on to 2.5 because there are pieces of this standard that are actually not all ConeBeam related. There is a part of the standard that's for general CT and other modalities. And so that's why we're jumping from section 2.2 to 2.5. In 2.5, we have regulatory requirements and testing protocols. And here we basically make sure that the equipment is following federal, state, and local requirements, that there's inspections taking place, that there's maintenance records, that the equipment is safely installed and safely disinfected, which now in the age of COVID-19 is particularly important. And here is a screenshot of part of the standard. So once upon a time, I was an Eagle Scout and I had to work my way through the Scout handbook and basically deal with things like this, where first you have standard details, what it is you've got to do, and then further explanation, what we're looking for as we're evaluating this, and then 3, what you need to submit to prove you've done it. So ultimately, this is all about uploading things to a portal, and we list out the documentation that has to be uploaded to that portal so that we can tell what was called for in the standard was actually completed. And so this is generally the approach the standard takes. Next up, I will talk about professional requirements. So here we've got one section, section 3, which is professional requirements, and then section 4, which is professional oversight. One of the complicating factors in developing the standard is that the way people are credentialed in the field of dentistry is not the same as it is in medicine, and ConeBeam is applicable to both. And so we've had to be cognizant of the way things happen in the dental world, while also supporting the way things happen in other worlds, such as the ENT world, and worked to handle both worlds at once. And this has been reflected in our continuing education requirements and our training requirements, and even in our language, talking about, for instance, a clinical director in this world rather than a medical director, with the understanding that it's not necessarily a physician. So we start out standard 3.1 with some general staffing requirements. This is the type of thing that HR would be responsible for in a larger organization, having an employee manual, job descriptions, job titles, etc. And then in 3.2, we move into credentialing, professional licensure, and qualifications. And we talk about what needs to be reviewed and submitted there to make sure that the people operating the equipment are properly trained. 3.3 B is the qualifications for the clinical director. It has a partner for medical, but we want to focus with ConeBeam CT on a standard that's really broad enough to support a potentially non-physician clinical director. And so with 3.3B, we do that. And then we likewise with 3.4B specify the interpreting providers requirements, 3.5B, the imaging technologist, 3.6, the imaging manager. Then we talk about the medical physicist requirements. And then finally, at the end of that section, the imaging safety officer's requirements. The idea is to make sure that there's an ecosystem of people in place that are properly qualified for the roles that they have, while recognizing that the norms in dentistry are different. And as we've written these requirements, we have, in many cases, created little sections that have additional requirements for different subspecialties. So, for instance, in standard 3.6C, we've got the training requirements. And depending on the type of person we're talking about, they're going to have different types of training. And so we've got requirements for dental maxillofacial, we've got a separate set for ENT, a separate set for orthopedics, podiatric, and mammography. And so the reason why we've done this is because we want to acknowledge that there are different requirements for people that are using ConeBeam in different ways, and that it's just important that people are prepared to use it properly for the use case that they're going to use it for. But obviously we can't hold people using it for dental to the same thing we would hold a podiatrist to. We have to make some accommodations for that. And then in standard 4, we go into professional oversight. So with professional oversight, we are defining what people's responsibilities are in the various jobs that we just described the qualifications for in the prior standard. And it's really the same set of jobs: the medical and clinical director, the interpreting provider, the imaging technologist, the imaging manager, the medical physicist, and the imaging safety officer. In this way, the organization is utilizing these personnel in the way we would imagine them to do so, and their use will be consistent with our intentions. So, yeah, okay, back one, great. So one of the things to mention is that we've had to think a lot about continuing education and what does a person have to have done to be prepared to safely take and interpret images for the general public. And on the one hand, we don't want to have the requirements be so onerous that no one can meet them. They're not practical. On the other hand, we don't want them to be so lax that we're not sure of people's preparedness to safely deliver high quality imaging. And so what we've done is we've set some thresholds about what the initial requirements should be upon certification, and then what continuing requirements should be as people get their certification renewed. So we've done this for the medical director, the clinical director, the interpreting physician, the interpreting provider, and then with cardiac imaging, the radiologist and cardiologist, the nuke med physician. We've also set requirements for the medical imaging technologist as well. And so the idea is that people have some experience with studies in the past, that they get some continuing medical education or continuing education, and then that they continue to do so on an ongoing basis. And while doing this, we've been cognizant of the differences in the types of education available to people in different fields. There's not the same world and set of offerings in the of continuing education in dental versus medical. The goal has been to create a harmonized set of professional requirements that are as uniform as possible, but also acknowledge these differences. We've also spent some time looking into issues related to scope of practice. So standard 3.4, we've got the interpreting provider qualifications. There we look at professional licensure for the specialty, making sure people are following state regulations, that they're board certified or eligible for the specialty, that they've done the residency if applicable, that they've completed the necessary minimum training and ongoing training, and that they recognize that they will only interpret within the bounds of their training. We don't want a person interpreting a different part of the body. So if someone that's trained in the head shouldn't be looking at the feet and vice versa. And also we have requirements for radiologist overreads. In the initial CT training section, we talk about what the training should entail. Namely, people need to be trained about review common pathology that you'd see in a CT. They need to understand artifacts. They need to understand how to protect the patient, how to use the minimum amount of radiation possible to safely ensure quality image. So with all of this, what our goal is to ensure that the providers are properly trained and to provide a common vocabulary for what that means, given that the people that are going through this may be from a broad variety of backgrounds. Next up, we've got the quality assurance requirements. So it's important to have programs in place to ensure that quality care is being delivered, that there's a process for regulatory compliance, for resolving complaints, for storing images properly, that there are policies and procedures in place for all these things. And along with it, we have the quality and patient safety requirements, requirements for quality assurance program, the patient and personnel safety program, medical imaging policies, patient access, patient confidentiality, and financial integrity. We want to make sure that these organizations are running safe practices and that they have the processes in place to ensure their safety. On the next slide, we have a bit of a deeper dive into the general quality assurance program requirements. So you see that there has to be this oversight committee or formal panel that includes the participation of the medical or clinical director that's overseeing the program, and it has to track complaints and errors and concerns. It has to be updated periodically. There have to be clinical protocols that meet established standards. And the goal here is to make sure that there's a whole process in place within the organization that's conscious of quality, working to address it, working to keep things current, and working to address any defects that there may be. And while this slide shows our standard looking at it from a general sense, we've also, shown on the next slide, really thought about what needs to be done from the perspective of ConeBeam CT. And so here we have, for instance, requirements for an audit program where there's some auditing happening to ensure that quality is taking place and that there's not excessive retakes. And we define what exactly the quality control program needs to be in the context of this modality. So I know this has been a lot of material to go through quickly, but as you can see, we're trying to address structural quality, process quality, and now, as Dr. Siegel will tell you in the next set of slides, outcome quality, making sure that the program has put in place the things that it needs to be able to deliver quality ConeBeam imaging. So Dr. Siegel, thank you again for participating and for your help with the standard.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for a great overview. I think this is probably a good point to underscore the fact that ConeBeam CT is very different than non-ConeBeam CT, and that there are fairly unique requirements with regard to assessing quality, looking at radiation dose, and looking at the physics. The method of acquisition is substantially different for ConeBeam in comparison with non-ConeBeam. And so that makes it particularly important to look at the technical quality. And I think although the images look fairly similar in the same areas of the body between ConeBeam and non-ConeBeam scanners, the method of quality assessment and the method of acquisition are substantially different. And so one of the things that RadSite has done uniquely in comparison to any of the other accreditation organizations is to develop some of these requirements. And one of the challenges is that these really have not been harmonized. Even the AAPM, the American Association of Physicists in Medicine, do not have standards at this point specific to ConeBeam technology. And that includes phantoms for making measurements. And so at the current state of the art, each one of the manufacturers ends up setting its own internal quality requirements, which I think is helpful for a particular machine, but certainly does not facilitate being able to compare radiation dose, for example, across multiple different machines, or assess image quality. If vendor A is using Phantom A and vendor B is using Phantom B and vendor C, Phantom C, it makes it a challenge to be able to actually cross-compare them for shopping purposes and also for accreditation purposes. And so one of the major thrusts of the work that we've done has been to look at the potential to be able to have a single phantom that would allow us to measure from multiple different systems. So with regard to the specifics for technical quality, we have general requirements for ConeBeam, and then specifically requirements for physics and image quality evaluation. So not only do we specify what it would require to pass and what the expectations are for physics image quality, but also there are requirements with experts in their field in assessing the images that are actually produced by these ConeBeam systems to determine whether or not they're acceptable, and acceptable not only from a physics perspective, but also from an image quality perspective. And so you can see there are multiple standards that address these issues, and also these appendices that are being referenced on the right specifically look at scoring the physics parameters as well as the subjective image quality assessment that is done by those with expertise in ConeBeam image interpretation. So next slide, please. With regard to image selection, we're looking at a fair amount of granularity in the assessment of the images themselves. So for example, the type of examination, are the images actually pertinent and relevant? Dr. Harrell was talking specifically about his work and expertise in dental ConeBeam scanning, and is the area that's covered actually, or is the exam that was required actually the one that is optimal for the clinically indicated reason? And so looking at anatomic coverage. In general, we want to cover all of the area that is clinically needed, but not any more or not any less than that. And so is the anatomic coverage appropriate? Field of view size. overall, as any of the technologists who may be on the webinar know, or maybe watching it know, it's really important to have a field of view that is optimizing the area that you're looking at. You want the field of view to essentially completely cover the acquisition matrix. And as far as resolution, clearly we want to acquire the highest resolution images, meaning getting the sharpest images and being able to collect a level of detail that allows us to be able to reconstruct in any plane. Dr. Harrell mentioned the relatively low risk associated with radiation exposure. Just to give you an idea, the doses that he's talking about are pretty comparable to the dose associated with a chest radiograph. But one of the challenges is, and Dr. Harrell mentioned some of the doses in microsieverts, but the challenge is that there is no standard across multiple vendors and manufacturers for reporting out the dose. And so you could have the same effective dose delivered to a patient from 5 different vendors and have each of the vendors report out a different number, because there is not a standardization of the way that this is measured in any way that's close to non-ConeBeam CT. And so this is really important. And if we are going to go as low as reasonably achievable, as we do in general for all things related to radiation in healthcare, we need a standardized way to be able to measure that. And then, of course, figuring out what is an appropriate slice thickness to maximize the quality of the images, minimize the averaging that one can get with thicker slices, and be able to look at what is optimal slice thickness and is it actually appropriate to the study that's being performed. Next slide, please.
Well, thank you, Dr. Siegel. That's very helpful. And this is Gary. I just wanted to say a few words real quickly about the accreditation review process related to ConeBeam CT. It's going to mirror the workflows associated with the traditional MIPA accreditation program. And if you want to hear a little bit more detail about the accreditation process, there's actually another webinar that RadSite hosted in April that goes in a little bit more detail that's available on our website. But obviously, understanding the standards is one step to the entire accreditation review process. And one of the taglines I like to say is that, in accrediting for 25 or thereabout years, over 5,000 different organizations, no company's gone through any of the accreditation programs that I've helped run without making at least one substantive change. And the goal is really to kind of identify opportunities for improvement and really use this as a reflection point for any organization, in this case, a ConeBeam CT imaging provider, to really kind of make sure they're shoring up their workflows. As Dr. Powell described, basically the key benchmarks of process structure and outcome measures. I have Julie Irons, RadSite's accreditation manager, was kind enough to kick off the webinar, so she's actually on the call of the webinar today. So I thought I just would ask her to say a few words about the accreditation review process, and she lives and breathes this on a daily basis. Julie?
Sure, thank you. So the accreditation review process, of course, number one always starts with reviewing the standards. Once you've decided to move forward, then we have a portal where you will do everything. You'll follow the standards. You'll have questions to answer. You'll have documents to upload. You'll have of course, your clinical studies to upload, as well as your phantoms and physics to upload. Once everything is completed, then we move into that accreditation review process. And there are 3 reviewers, one for each section. One will do the desktop reviews. She will review all of the answers to your questions. She'll review all of the documents you've uploaded and that sort of, thing to get back to you if there's any issues, that sort of thing. Then a radiologist will review your images. And again, if there's any issues, we do an RFI and get back to you. The same with the physics. We have our physicist reviewer who does the physics review. Once all the reviews are completed, we then move on to the accreditation committee. And as it says, all the applications are blinded, so the committee does not know who they are reviewing based off of the recommendations of the 3 reviewers. As you can see, we have a pass, fail, and a corrective action. For the most part, we are trying to educate you during the application process, so we're pretty good there. We do have an on-site happens within the 3-year of your accreditation cycle. There is an appeal process, and as we said, the cycle is 3 years, which is the same as the other organizations. So this is where you would log in at the portal. If you're a first timer, you'll register first before logging in. The process is streamlined. It is cloud hosted. There are user permissions, so you might be the primary, but you may have a colleague who should be able to log in, and they can register, and then we can attach them to your facility so that they can see the applications. We highly suggest this because that way, if there are any issues with your application, then each person logging in has their own login, so we're able to handle that. The images are not handled on our site. We do have a link that goes to the Umbra Health, where your DICOM images are uploaded there. It is HIPAA secure, and everything is proper there. And of course, that's where our reviewers go in order to do the image review and the physics review. Okay, and so this is once you have completed everything, as you can see in the sample here, everything is the application is complete, everything has been done, then you get that final submit button. You can also see here the different tabs that we ask information about. The preliminary is when you're originally setting up the application. Then you move to the facility questions, questions about your technologist, questions of the document uploads. Then the scanner is the questions about your specific scanner, your imaging system, and then the studies is where you get that link to the DICOM grid. Once the accreditation committee has reviewed the reviewers' reports and approved your accreditation, then you get a certificate, which is good for the 3 years. So, and then of course we include you in our online portal so that anybody and everybody can look there to see who is accredited by RadSite.
Well, thank you, Julie. Yeah, so we've tried to put together, I think, a best-in-class accreditation experience that's still meaningful and really tries to educate providers, inspire them. The old saying, a lifting tide raises all boats. So really try to get imaging providers at the next level, but also have a two-way communication feedback loop because we're always learning along the process. I want to make sure we leave, Julie, about 5 minutes for perhaps some of the questions that have come in. And so I just want to touch upon with Dr. Siegel just a couple quick public policy initiatives that RadSite's working on. And those of you who are on the webinar are welcome to contact us if you're interested in getting involved. And then wrap up with Dr. Harrell and then take some questions. But one of the initiatives is working with a lot of large employer groups through the National Alliance for Healthcare Purchasing Cooperatives with an initiative called Evaluate, which is a national RFI. So we've been meeting since November to basically identify key areas in terms of imaging performance that may help employers and do a better job, kind of benchmarking best practices, evidence-based practices. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about this initiative, we'd love to share that with you. The goal is we're drafting an issue brief right now on the topics, and then actually a set of RFP questions will go out to the national health plans through the annual release of Evaluate, and then a lot of these variables will be potentially included in future RFPs when health plans are making purchasing decisions about imaging provider workflows. Dr. Siegel, you want to talk a little bit about the RSNA initiative?
Sure, Gary. So to keep with the theme of wrapping up quickly, I'll be brief. The RSNA's Quantitative Imaging Biomarkers Alliance, it's really an interesting effort to try to make sure that measurements that are made in clinical practice have a similar level of rigor to those that might be made with a research multi-center trial, for example. And so if I am measuring a lesion, or if I'm doing a dental implant, for example, then I want to be sure that it really doesn't matter which machine I'm using or which vendor's machine I'm using, that the measurements are uniform and the same across different systems. And so creating an additional level of standard beyond what we've talked about so far to try to ensure that quantitative measurements, whether they're Hounsfield units, whether those are volumetric measurements or linear distance measurements, those are all uniform, regardless of the fact that we have variety in the acquisition and reconstruction techniques. And so being able to have that level of additional certification or accreditation that makes one feel comfortable about the quantitative measurements is really what KIBA is all about. And RadSite has been working with the RSNA's KIBA effort to look at how we might be able to create accreditation or special recognition for those that are willing to meet that higher bar of quantitative standardization. So thanks, Gary.
You want to just mention real quickly the UCSF initiative with CMS?
Sure, just super quickly, it turns out that some people who interpret imaging studies kind of believe beauty's in the eye of the beholder, but that creates a major problem when we're assessing quality. Most of what we've talked about so far has been physics assessment of quality and sort of subjective assessment of quality by experts. But we know experts can vary, and trying to figure out, is there a quantitative mechanism to be able to actually determine quality? And so this is part of an effort that RadSite has been working with a number of different teams across the US in looking at utilizing deep learning, convolutional neural networks, artificial intelligence, to be able to take large numbers of images reviewed by large numbers of experts, and then to predict for any new given image how experts might rate that image with regard to quality. So you literally have an AI system that's able to guess how humans would assess quality, at least, consensus panel would suggest it. So it's a really cool, exciting effort, and it's sort of the way that RadSite is essentially extending technology to the cutting, bleeding edge. So thanks, Gary.
Thanks. So let's take a couple minutes and take some questions, but Dr. Harold, do you want to make any kind of final observations before we switch to Q&A with Julie?
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for attending. I really appreciate your interest, and like Gary said, any kind of feedback you can get with RadSite and get with them. What we're doing right now is trying to finish up the beta testing and get some final approval, and building out the accreditation portal, and then trying to launch these new standards soon. You can see RadSite's really kind of taking the lead on this, and to get coordinating key public policy initiatives in the national leadership, and to be best in class in the accreditation experience. I think this is really going to elevate us, especially in dentistry, but in all forms of the medical and dental professions that are beginning to use ConeBeam, so we have a higher level of standardization and accreditation to this. I appreciate everybody being here.
Thank you. Julie, I know we only have a couple minutes left. I know over a half dozen questions have come in, so I'll let you kind of select maybe one or two to quickly ask our panelists real quickly.
Sure. There's a question about the physics. So if medical ConeBeam CT systems have been on the market for over 10 years, why has no one developed specific accreditation standards for these systems yet?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. We've actually picked the two experts that we know in the country, John Boone and Jeff Sewardson, who have written a lot of literature in ConeBeam CT physics. And we've been waiting, and they've been waiting for many years for AAPM to approve of standards. In fact, RadSite actually commissioned a paper by the two of those, a white paper, looking at the current state of the art. And since they're going to be, I think, writing many of the standards for AAPM, they will be setting those. Why it's taken 10 years for ConeBeam CT, I just think it takes a long time to do standards, and ConeBeam CT volumes have increased precipitously in just the last few years. And so we all would agree with you completely. We're really waiting for those AAPM standards, but it's been wonderful getting a preview from those two experts of what they are likely to contain, and to be able to embed them in our RadSite standards, so we can, as I mentioned, stay cutting edge. So great question. It should have taken a lot less than 10 years, and I'm hoping it doesn't take another 10 years for everyone else to come aboard with their own standards. But RadSite has ours out, and ours will be out in the next few weeks. We think those will represent the next generation of AAPM standards. So thanks.
Great. Julie, one more question?
Sure. And kind of following up with what Dr. Siegel said, someone asked about how do they get a copy of the new standards for ConeBeam?
That's for you, Gary.
Yeah, so we distribute all our standards on a complimentary basis off the website. So they will be publicly available as soon as the ConeBeam CT Standards Committee does their final approval, and it goes to the RadSite Board of Managers. I'm hoping it's going to be sometime in July. We also will submit it to some of our payer and colleagues and CMS for review and approval too. So there may be slight changes, but we'll track it with different versions. So stay tuned. If you're interested in getting involved right away, then reach out to Julie Irons or myself on staff, and we'll follow up with you and give you a more detailed briefing. Again, it's been very beneficial for us to work with the half dozen or so ConeBeam CT imaging providers that are working through us through the beta test cycle. So we always enjoy those kind of working relationships. And of course, once we get the standards finalized, it'll be a little bit more formal. So thank you, Julie. I want to thank everybody for being on the call today. I want to thank the panelists for their tremendous effort in terms of supporting this 2-year journey, which is not ending. It's just a benchmark as we really finalize the standards. And then we're hoping that, similar to my earlier comments, that we're forming a community that we can really open up and be transparent to all the stakeholders. I mean, in this case, clearly at the right time for the right situation, it can really benefit the patient to have an access to a ConeBeam CT image as part of the diagnostic choices out there. So we're hoping that we can kind of move this forward, deal with the issues that are a little bit more of a challenge, both from the perspective of the interpreting provider, the patient, the payer that has to pay for this, and just making sure, again, we're kind of moving the ball forward in terms of sound evidence-based pathways. Please stay in tune. We do have a summer webinar series coming up. In July, we'll be talking about COVID-19 and how imaging providers are adjusting to that. And pursuant to Dr. Siegel's comments, we're excited that in August we'll be featuring Dr. Boone and Dr. Severson in terms of their work on the ConeBeam CT physics. And then in September, we're hoping to talk a little bit about the Evaluate initiative and what employers are thinking about in terms of 2021 performance-based, perhaps value-based purchasing initiatives. So please stay in touch. We're part of this community. We want you to be part of our community. And thank you very much for your time. And Julie, thank you for helping us host this webinar today. So that will be it. We'll wrap up. Thanks so much.
All right, we're done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great.
I'm gonna disconnect now if that's okay, or anything else?
Yep.